The Guided Goals podcast gives you the tools, direction, and resources you need to pursue your passion project. I'm Deborah Eckerling, Project Catalyst, and this is the Guided Goals podcast. Our guest today is Harry Duran, and we're going to talk about interviewing guests for your podcast. And I'm feeling very, very meta today. We'll also talk about maintaining ongoing engagement with guests well after their episode is live. Harry is the host of Podcast Junkies and the founder of FullCast, a full-service podcast concierge service. Welcome, Harry. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Deborah.
Would you like to share a little bit more about your background and how you became you?
How much time do you have?
You could do it in a minute, right?
Yeah, sure. The short version. So I think as it relates to the podcast, I always had an interest in podcasts as it related to music because I grew up as a fan of electronic music and I DJ myself. So I even built a mobile app for electronic music fans, and that's sort of the reason why I went to New Media Expo in January of 2014. And then I was just captivated by all the podcasters that were there because I was thinking of starting a podcast. And the thought came to me, why not start a show where I interview other podcasters? It's kind of meta, but I'm naturally curious, and I think the platform provides a unique way for you to just get a peek behind the curtains of some of the people you admire and see what works, what doesn't, what inspires them. And for some of the people that I've had the privilege of having on my show, what it takes to keep going at this, for some of these people, it's almost 10 years. And so I've been doing that, and I've up to 70 episodes now, and I've had just a fantastic range of guests, old schoolers like Dave Jackson and Daniel Day-Lewis and Ray Ortega and Elsie Escobar. And then people that are new into podcasting but are important names in the storytelling space. For example, I just had Leah Tao from the podcast Strangers on, and Bill Burrell from Home Stories from LA. So I'm trying to broaden the range and not just keep it entrepreneurial as I did when I started. And I'm anyone who's got a podcast that I've had the opportunity to engage with is usually fair game. I usually try to have some sort of relationship with them beforehand because it makes the conversation that much more engaging. And the episodes go for at least an hour, sometimes an hour and a half.
Do you find your guests to interview just because they're people you know? Or do you have a plan? What is your process for finding and reaching out to the people that you interview?
So in the beginning, like every new podcaster, you're reaching out to everyone that's willing to come on the show. And because I was at New Media Expo, I got to see a lot of podcasters. And one of the breakout sessions that I saw was Chase Reeves, who's the host of the Fizzle Show. Really fantastic show for entrepreneurs. And he's just got an engaging, fun personality. And I sort of targeted him early on. I interacted with him at his talk, and he kept in touch online. And so I asked him to be one of my first guests, and he gladly obliged. And then I was just looking for people online that I could engage with and start a conversation with. And as a result, I had people like Greg Hickman and Cynthia Sanchez from Also Interesting on early. And so those were some of those key episodes that I launched with. I like to have some sort of connection with the guest, as the show matures. I think that provides a unique dynamic for the listener because you really get to listen as if you're eavesdropping on a couple of friends having a conversation. And that's really like the mood that I'm going for. And one of the things I call this show is the podcaster's voice. It's conversations, candid conversations with interesting podcasters. And so in order for me to make that claim, I have to do a little bit of homework on my end, make sure they are interesting, and it's not going to be a bunch of dead air when we get on the phone and I ask a question and they just give a one-word response.
What are some of the things that you recommend for someone who's not as well-schooled as interviewing, who's perhaps just starting out? What do you recommend they do?
So if you're going to be focused on interviews, one of the and it's part of what I alluded to, is to have, first of all, have someone on there who you have an interest in speaking to. Don't just have someone on there because you think they're a big name and they're going to help your show, and you think, oh, I need to. If you're if you're doing podcasts on productivity and this is the number one productivity guru, then automatically you're going to target that person. It may not be a fit for you, and I think it won't be a fit for your audience. You need to, over time, figure out who your audience is and who you're catering to, and obviously, when you're first starting, you won't have a lot of that information handy. So you just have to try to engage with every single person on Twitter and every single person on Facebook and every single email, because they're all important. And then as you start to have guests, your guests become just as important too. And, follow what they're doing, engage with them, treat them like royalty, not only in the time leading up to the interview and during the interview, but I think even more importantly after. Because it shows that you're taking an interest in what they're doing, and you weren't just using them for any clout that they might have provided. And then when it comes to the actual interview, listen. It sounds really basic, and I think it gets overlooked sometimes. But you need to really pay attention to what your guest is saying, and not staring at your list of 10 questions and worry that you're not going to get through, or worry that your guest is going long on the last question because you want to squeeze in, the 5 that someone said you needed to ask, or you need to get to that hot, that lightning round, or the asking them their favorite Sunday, or just like these questions that you force into the format, because you've been rigid about what your show is and what you think your show needs to have. And if that's what you want to do, then you're going to have one type of show. You're going to have a formulaic show, and you're going to have to work hard to inject your personality into there, because it's going to be the same questions every time. So you're going to have to differentiate yourself through your personality, through your energy. I know sometimes, and I've done it in the past, some podcasters will actually stand. I'm on a boom mic right now, so I could easily stand and lift the mic up and have the interview while I'm standing, and it changes the dynamic really of the energy, because your diaphragm's open. So that's one tip listeners can try if they're having an interview. Or sometimes right before an interview, you want to get ready. You want to have your water. You want to have your chapstick. Whatever it is you need to do, so you're not licking your lips or whatever it is you do when you're thirsty and it's coming across, and you're going to have to edit that out later, or you're nervous or your mouth is dry. So just think of all those things you need to do. Have your checklist ready. Treat it as if you're a pilot getting ready to fly a plane. There's a book called Checklist Manifesto that just talks about all the different things they need to do.
What are ways for people, I don't want to say to develop their personality, but maybe even amplify their personality so it shows through even a little bit better?
I think you have to think about what it is you're going to amplify, right? Because if you are naturally an introvert, there's not going to be much there to start with. But what I think you can do is, it may sound really basic, but something that comes to mind is to live an interesting life and have a lot of things that interest you. Because if you think about a conversation is really, two people talking about a topic that's of interest to both of them, and that goes whether it's in a bar or in a meeting at a conference or in a hallway or on a podcast or on a train or on a bus or at Thanksgiving, just whatever it is. The best conversations are when the two people are connected and they're engaged. And so the way to do that is find something. If you're leading the conversation, then find a topic of a conversation that you can talk about, and that you have something, you have an opinion about. Because I think you don't want to be someone who's just rattling off factoids because you have the news app open on your phone and you think, well, this is what people are talking about. But as you dive deeper, or is that something that interests you? And they're like, no, I just heard people talking about it. And it's almost one of the reasons why I actually look at less news now, because I don't want to feel like my only topic of conversation is the news of the day. because a lot of the times it's just really depressing stuff anyway, and it's not something I want to talk about. So I tend to pick topics, and in my case, podcasting, or ask me about electronic music, or ask me about meditation, or ask me about consciousness, or ask me about traveling, or going to different countries. Those are things that light me up, and those are the things that I'm excited to talk about. So I think trying to find that common ground is really, really important, because you can't forget the third person in the room, who's the listener, right? Mm-hmm. And they want to hear an engaging and interesting conversation. You should have a discerning ear. You should have a discerning ear as an interviewer, as an interviewee, and as a listener.
The key is basically to have conversations that interest you, that appeal to your audience.
Yes.
Because they're going to want to listen in. And I love how you put in the listener as the third person in the conversation, because it's very, very simple and accurate way to look at it. And perhaps that's something people don't always think about. You're not performing, you're having a conversation, and someone is eavesdropping because you want them to. I do want to touch on this because it was mentioned in the intro about maintaining the ongoing engagements after your episodes. What are a couple of the things that you do to do that?
So, as I touched upon earlier, it's really important when I think about the fact that a guest came on my show and they took time, and a lot of times early on with an unknown commodity and an unknown person. And so there's a couple of things that I do. Some simple things, for example, in Gmail, I create you can use filters, right? So if something comes in from this address, do this. So one of the basic things that I do is I create a filter and a rule for all the emails that I have for my previous guests, and I put them in a separate folder that stands out on its own within Gmail, and you can change the filters to say move it out of your inbox, don't mark it as read, and keep it there so it stays highlighted and stays bold. And so I have a whole section called PJ-guests, which is anyone who's been a guest on Podcast Junkies. If there's any sort of email interaction, or they're sending me an email about something, or they have something they're promoting, I see that right away. And so, okay, let me check what my guests are up to. So that's one interesting way that I have to keep tabs of what they're doing. And then to mirror that on Twitter, I create a list of all my guests' Twitter handles. And so I can go into, Powerful Podcast Junkies. The other thing I do is, for some reason, I give these Twitter lists unique names and funny names. I think when I first started, anyone that had a podcast, I was putting them into Palatable Podcast Pioneers or something like that. So every once in a while, I'd see people say, "Thanks for adding me to this group. And by the way, what a cool name." And so, you got to think outside the box when you're fresh and when you're new, because just to get people's attention. So one of the groups that I create is a Twitter email list of only people that have been on my show. And so, once or twice a week, I go through the list and I say, okay, what are they up to? Because sometimes the feed is so fast, you'll lose people. And so even people that you follow, and I've got like thousands of followers and thousands of people that I follow, it's really hard to just follow the stream. So you have to create the lists, the curated list, if you really want to keep track of them. And so inevitably there's something that someone made a comment on that I have an opinion on, or I want to put in my 2 cents. And I think it's a nice way to show that I'm still maintaining engagement. And so the other thing I do is, obviously, I create artwork for every single episode, and I use the guest's bio and to put them in a good light and highlight them. And so recently there was a format that I was using for social media, and that I felt had gotten a little bit dated. And so not only was I using a new format for my new guests, but I thought, you know what, I want to make my old guests still look good, So I recycle my old guests' episodes through Twitter, and I use a tool called Edgar to do that. So what I did is, I think I was at episode 30 or 40, and I started going back to episode 1, starting with Chase Reeves, and I redid his artwork, even though his episode came out in April 2014, and I only circulated every once in a while through Twitter. I said, you know what, I wanted to show up, professional, modern, and current, in line with what I'm doing for the rest of my guests. And so I did that. And then you stay engaged with what your guests are doing, and it's not only guests that are coming up or guests that have been on your show. If they've got anything they want to promote, make sure you reach out to them and see how you can help them and connect them with other guests. And I know it's pretty basic. At the end of the interview, you ask them if there's anything that they've got coming up that you can help promote. And a lot of times, as a podcast host, you're more concerned with them promoting you, but you should be just as concerned with ways you can promote them. And so, for example, I've got Johnny Nastor. I haven't really announced it yet, but Johnny Nastor from Hack the Entrepreneur. He's got a really popular podcast, and he's going to be on my show in a couple of weeks. He recently had a book launch, and so through a Facebook group that we share, I saw that he was launching it, and he used Thunderclap, a promotional service, to launch it. So I really quickly signed up as to help promote that book. So always be on the lookout for little things you can do that show your guests that it's important for them to engage. And so it's important for you to engage with them and that you value the relationship. So I was recently at well, not recently now because it's already 2016, but I was at Podcast Movement in Texas in July last year, and I had T-shirts made. Custom T-shirts, Podcast Junkies, which is a bright orange and that you really can't miss when you were roaming the hallways. And I made enough that I would have one for every single guest that was at Podcast Movement. So I reached out to them ahead of time. I said, "Hey guys, are you going to be at Podcast Movement? I've got a gift for you. And the other thing I want to do is take a group picture." So it was a bit like herding cats, as you might imagine. But I was able to get a nice shot. So if you look at my Twitter page. At the header is that group shot that I managed to take with at least about 10 or 15 of my guests, and I'm going to do it again at Podcast Movement this year, and I think I'm planning to head to Podfest in Tampa, Florida as well, and I'll do it again, and I think it's just little things I do to just keep engaged, keep the relationship going, and for me, it's like a lifetime relationship. It's not something that they help me out with, or I use them for this short period of time, and then I forget about them. So it's just little ideas, and hopefully it'll prompt some other ideas in the listener's mind about things you can do to just maintain that engagement over an extended period of time.
It's not podcast specific, so whatever sort of format that you're engaging with, either interviewees or influencers or whatever, you're developing a friendship and you're treating people the way you would want to be treated. What is it that you do to maintain balance in your life?
I think the most important thing I do is have a regular meditation schedule. So it's been something that's important for me for years. My most recent episode was with an old friend of mine, Morgan Dixon, who we were on a meditation retreat together. And so that if you want to hear us go in depth about the importance of meditation and mindfulness, that most recent episode covers it really well. But for me, I found that it sort of grounds you in a way that prepares you for what's to come that day. And sometimes you don't know what's to come. And so you want to be mentally set for the ups and downs. And it's something that you need to do on a regular basis. And we all have our businesses. We all have our passion projects. We all have our hobbies. But just try to be a well-rounded person and try to have a practice that's outside of this business realm. I try to make it a point to go and walk my dog. I'm working from home. I do have my home office, but you have to tear your eyes away from that screen. I mean, just even to rest your eyes is something that's truly important. And go stare at like something green. Or go walk around the block, and a lot of times you'll be surprised at what pops into your head as a result of doing that walk. You just sometimes need a change of scenery.
And I like to leave my listeners or viewers, depending on how you're getting this content, with some goals, and that's our personal goal of the week, is to start to initiate some sort of daily practice where even if it's for 5 minutes, where you are stepping away and regrounding yourself and reprioritizing. And I think, what's a good professional goal?
Write your goals down on paper. Write what you want to accomplish today. Don't have more than 3 things you want to accomplish in one day. It's not going to happen. What are the 3 most important things you want to get done today? Write those down and do those. Or even better, what's the one thing you could do that's going to move your business forward or generate income for you if you're you have a business where you need to make sales? do that one thing first, and then everything else that you have on your to-do list, those are your nice to haves. Then you can work on those.
So anyone who's listening right now, when you're done listening to this podcast, we want you to do one thing that will move forward your project today, and then do it again tomorrow and the day after that.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Harry Duran, Podcast Junkies, for joining us today to offer insight not only about podcasting and interviewing, but on setting and moving forwards with your goals for your business. And listeners, you've got stuff to do. Not too much stuff, but come up with some good focused goals that will move you forward, and then let us know how you're doing in the comments.